I'd like to take this opportunity to locate us as best as I can based on my more than 30 years of working this terrain. I want to begin by saying that this is a frontier, that the area of leadership as a study, of practice, and as a way of intervening into societies or cultures is an immature area. It's an undisciplined area. We could not even call it a field as yet. It's quite important to locate where we are in the intellectual development and in the practice development of our area, because then we can be more careful in engaging people in dialogue or in interventions with an experimental mindset, informing people from the beginning that what we're doing is at a frontier, and to be careful, we can be more careful in inoculating ourselves against the temptation to oversell or overpromise what we can deliver, even to deliver on the problem of implementation, which is such a profound problem for an organization like the bank, which has been full of great ideas, or the Kennedy School, or other institutions which generate great ideas that end up not being implemented. But the frontier of implementation is a big frontier, and how to help people make a difference, and how to build capacity for making a difference, for working the hardest problems facing a community or even a family at the micro level is a big frontier. From a purely intellectual point of view, the area of leadership studies is young, even though the practice may be as ancient as human civilization. It's not like a field like physics or engineering or economics, in which there are already an agreed-upon set of basic terms, and upon which a whole superstructure of an infrastructure of concepts has been developed. And where, although two economists may disagree at very sophisticated levels on what policy might be best to apply, they will agree on a whole host of terms and concepts. That's also true amongst physicists or engineers or medical doctors or legal scholars. But it's not true in the area of leadership studies. If we look at our basic terminology, key words, leadership, management, authority, power, influence, citizenship, and you pick up any book on leadership, people will be using these same terms in very different ways. We have not yet become disciplined in the sense of having a common vocabulary upon which we can then build a commonly tested and agreed upon set of robust ideas, and then start arguing at more sophisticated levels of application. We're at that stage of intellectual development where we don't yet have even a basic terminology. In most fields, there is the colloquial use of words, and then there's the expert use of those same words. In developing an analytical vocabulary, experts will borrow from the colloquial expression, the colloquial vocabulary. They'll steal those words and then they'll reuse them, but in much more refined and narrow ways. A physicist at a party may describe a person as being a force of nature. But in the laboratory, the physicist will use the word force in a much more specific way, in trying to describe the relationship between mass and acceleration and the energy that it takes to cause a mass to accelerate. But that's not the way the physicist is using the terms at a dinner party. That's not what he or she is describing when they're describing a person's presence or personality or their ability to move other people. So we need, in the area of leadership studies or in the area of leadership intervention, to at least begin to realize that we have ourselves the intellectual challenge of clarifying the terms we're using, and to understand that the way we're often using them more analytically is narrower than the way they're generally used in common colloquial ways. And we have to then be able to shift gears from the colloquial usage to a more expert analytical usage to begin to develop a more disciplined way of studying and intervening into people's lives. So what I'd like to share with you are my own efforts to try to define and make sense of this terminology. I think there are three fundamental confusions, at least three, in the way we conceptualize leadership, trying to borrow from common colloquial or cultural usage. The first is we tend to equate leadership with a set of personal characteristics. The second is we tend to equate leadership with authority. We talk normally about the leadership of a company, the leadership of an organization, the leadership of the World Bank, the leadership of the House or Senate up the street from here, or the leadership of a school district or business. But in all those cases, we're talking about people in high positions of authority. Whether or not those people practice any leadership is a secondary question. We know intuitively because we constantly complain about the lack of leadership of the leadership. We say the leadership isn't practicing any leadership. Well, I think those of us who are working with these words need to begin to distinguish leadership from authority so that we can begin to understand that what we're really saying, what people are really struggling to say and articulate, is that people in high positions of authority frequently don't lead. And that distinction becomes useful for at least three key reasons. We can begin to analyze the way in which having authority in politics, in government, of particular relevance to those of us in development, people in politics or in government, in authority positions, are constrained. That having a high position of authority doesn't only give you a set of tools and resources to work with, it also gives you a straitjacket. It also limits you, your degrees of freedom. There are reasons why people in high positions of authority often don't lead. Because if they were to practice leadership, they would risk their authority. They would be saying things that their authorizing environment, often ultimately various coalition groups or citizens, don't really want to hear yet. And then we can begin to understand why so many people practice leadership without authority. Because if we distinguish leadership from authority, we have a new category called leading without authority, or leading beyond your authority. And that becomes critically important because so many people in life do exercise leadership without waiting for the coach to call them into play, without waiting to be anointed or elected or appointed. Frequently, they have to lead across a boundary, laterally, in mobilizing people over whom they have no direct authority, or they have to lead their senior people in engaging their seniors to take risks and to find a way to operate on the razor's edge of challenging people to tackle tough problems without getting neutralized. And frequently then they have to lead people out into the countryside who may look to you without any authority at all. And then the third great advantage to distinguishing leadership from authority is we can begin to revalue authority itself as a critical virtue in human life, a virtue that nearly everyone has deep ambivalence about. So much ambivalence that when we distinguish leadership from authority, people immediately think leadership is the good stuff and authority is the bad stuff. But authority is absolutely vital to life, beginning with the family, because we certainly know how many dysfunctions exist in families because a parent or parents are ill-prepared for managing the boundaries of their authority in a trustworthy way. And yet all of us bear scars. When I start my course at the Kennedy School in the fall with 112 students from 40 different countries, most of whom are at mid-career, I frequently ask, how many of you have experienced abuse or violations of trust by people in positions of authority sometime in your lifetime, or at least in the history of your people, your gender, your ethnicity, your country, your culture? Nearly everybody raises their hand each year. 2 years ago, one person didn't raise his hand. I looked at him and I said, "Aren't you a lucky guy? What's your story? Where are you from?" Well, you know, he was a diplomat a white guy from New Zealand. And he was lucky. He just happened to have lived in a way that he was unscathed. But most of us bear a lot of scar tissue. And certainly in the development world, where people have enculturated distrust towards authority as a survival mechanism, because for so many centuries or decades or generations, authority was untrustworthy. Well, the challenge then of rehabilitating people's ability, people's capacity to trust one another, to give each other power in exchange for services. That's how I would define an authorizing relationship. Party A entrusts power to Party B in exchange for services. I authorize a car mechanic to fix my car. I authorize a doctor to fix my child. I authorize a politician to provide solutions to problems. The American Congress will authorize a government agency and will say, here's your grant of power and resources, but we're entrusting you with this power to provide services with integrity and competence. The two, from my point of view, basic terms of trust. Well, when people have had their trust violated, the rehabilitation of authority relationships, simply the capacity for people to say, I'll entrust you to run the ball down the field. We don't have to have a meeting just because I don't trust what's going to happen at the meeting if I'm not there. Sometimes we collaborate not because we really believe in learning across differences. We simply collaborate because we don't trust each other. So we got to make sure we're at the meeting. And then that generates enormous inefficiency. Because when I started off in medicine running emergency rooms, there are times for meetings and there are times to not have a meeting. So distinguishing leadership from authority becomes a profoundly important act. It enables us to do all three of these things. Understand the constraints of authority, and therefore when we're working with a client in authority, to begin to immediately place them, help them analyze their context, their authorizing environment. What are the expectations and services they're being expected to provide? If we're asking them to behave then differently, contrary to some of those expectations, then we have to help them move forward without getting themselves taken down. And then frequently we're asking people to lead beyond their authority. And we have to help people then come up with a strategy for leading when they don't have the authority to command or even convene, let alone decide. And then third, we can help rehabilitate people's capacity for authorizing relationships in the first place, which is a large generational cultural challenge. But as Jan was saying, at the heart of the problem of implementation. Because in the absence of trust, as Douglas North wrote beautifully about, an economic historian who won the Nobel Prize, you can't operate in a civilization without trust. But in our field, leadership development, rehabilitating a person's capacity to operate in a trustworthy fashion as an authority figure is not an easy task, because to gain authority in many societies, you have to play the game of corruption. And as soon as you begin playing the game of corruption, which of course is a wide spectrum of behaviors, some of which from a local point of view aren't corruption, they're just loyalties to family relationships. But at least helping people begin to work, what is it going to mean for them to behave in a trustworthy fashion? To manage the various temptations, their sexual hungers, their hungers towards grandiosity, their hunger towards control. These all come with the territory of leadership development in rehabilitating the capacity for people in a society to engage in healthy authority relationships. So in a sense, we have confused the inputs of personal capacity and the instruments of position, authority, power, and influence with the work of leadership. And I wouldn't define leadership as a set of personal characteristics. Of course, there have been hundreds of studies, maybe thousands of studies over the last 100 years, trying to identify what the common personal characteristics are. And you find that it's very hard to determine any because different cultures call forth different behaviors, and different problem contexts call forth different behaviors. And indeed, even these characteristics don't define the narrow space of leadership itself. For example, you could say that it helps in the practice of leadership to have courage, to be able to listen, to have an empathic imagination, to be able to understand wherever other people are coming from, to be persuasive. Well, all of that helps in romance, too. It also helps in raising children or being a salesperson at Best Buy. There's nothing definitional about those characteristics. They're ubiquitous in professional and even personal life, ubiquitous in their applicability. And again, the instruments, the tools of leadership are not the same as building the house. They're not the same as the work itself, which I would describe as building the capacity of people to solve problems and seize opportunities that themselves require the development of new capacity. And from nature, we see that the development of new capacity to face a changing and challenging world is really the way a biologist would describe the adaptive process. What does it mean for an organism to develop a new adaptive capacity, an adaptation so it can thrive in a changing environment? So this is how I would define leadership. Of course, I would simplify it simply to say mobilizing adaptive work. But this pulls in more threads. I define it as a practice, not as a set of personal characteristics again, because I think people who believe that they've got the right stuff, that they're born with the right capacity, are in trouble. And frequently are, in fact, dangerous. They don't realize how much they need to learn. They don't realize that the ability to diagnose a complex organizational or political system, to map the stakeholders, to understand the complexity of the dynamics generated by a very difficult, sometimes intractable set of problems, is not something you're born with. You may have, as a product of your upbringing, a terrific capacity to step back in the midst of action and reflect. But one still needs a framework to begin to analyze and diagnose those organizational systems. And one needs a framework to develop a strategy and a set of tactics to move forward against those problems. So I don't draw a bottom line on anybody's life or career. I don't even hardly ever use the term leader. I don't say he's a leader, she's a leader. Because I find that when you analyze somebody's career or somebody's life, you find that people have practiced leadership at some moments in time and not others. People in high positions of authority, like my current president, who I admire enormously, has exercised leadership on some policy areas and avoided it like the plague on other policy areas. Same with the previous president. Each of them have led on some issues and avoided leadership on other issues. And to draw a bottom line and say, he's a leader, she's a leader, ends up being, I think, unjust, unfair. Says more about our own point of view on do we like or dislike the areas where they practiced leadership the most or didn't than it says about them if you were to disaggregate their life's work Churchill is the most dramatic example. If he had died in 1938, he would have gone down in history as just a tragedy, of misleadership during World War I in the Admiralty, leading to tens of thousands of unnecessary casualties. And as soon as World War II was over, the British people kicked him out of government because he wanted to hold on to the empire. He was a dinosaur. But for those 6 years, he was a godsend to his people in meeting that particular challenge at that moment in time. So when we begin to view leadership as a practice, then when we're listening or talking or working with a client who feels enormously proud of themselves, they've achieved a high position of authority, they've been told since they were a child that they're special, and now you're working with them, and you've got to somehow work with them to understand that leadership as a practice is about the work facing them in their job, the work of mobilizing progress on some of the tough collective challenges that frequently fall across boundaries of their government or sets of institutions or villages. And that you're there to help them with all of their power and all of their strength and all of their talent deploy themselves effectively given the complexity of that particular problem context. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about authority as a social contract. And we know from studying nature and the behavior of animals that there are at least 3 basic functions that people look to authorities to provide. Direction for food every day. A child is born into the world designed to trust, melts into your arms, predisposed to live a social life, like many other social creatures. Looking every morning, every day, for the parent, the elder, to provide direction for food, to provide protection from danger, to generate order in their environment. And these basic social functions are at the heart of what authorities are expected to provide. And in a stable ecosystem, in the way that human beings lived for 6 million years as we began to depart and evolve and differentiate from our ancestral link to the chimpanzee, our closest relative. For 6-7 million years, we lived in small hunter and gatherer societies with lots of resources and a lot of land around us. Small little communities of 20 people. That's how we were designed. And in a stable ecosystem, the knowledge of where to find food every day, how to protect the band from a leopard or a predator, how to orient, resolve conflict, establish norms, all of that knowledge is carried generation to generation by the elders. And the system can work beautifully for many generations as long as the ecosystem remains relatively stable. A chimpanzee or gorilla society doesn't need leadership. It needs authority. It needs elders who know what to do. The alpha female chimpanzee to know what she must do to find food in the dry season or the rainy season, to know how to protect from a predator or provide order. And the same thing with the silverback male gorilla. As long as the ecosystem remains stable, they don't need leadership. But what happens when the troop meets a new challenge? A man with an automatic weapon. It will turn to the alpha because that's what they've always successfully done. It'll turn to the elder, tell us what we should do. The elder will pull out of his or her toolkit their best response. If they're lucky, they decide to run. If they're unlucky, they decide to cluster. Cluster is the wrong move against a man with an automatic weapon. So in a changing ecosystem, animals go extinct. They go extinct because they don't have the capacity to learn quickly enough, to develop the new adaptation quickly enough within a generation to survive and then thrive in that changed ecosystem. So that leads me to want to introduce this notion of adaptive work or adaptation as just one way of describing what other people have described as Phil Selznick described in 1957 in Leadership and Administration, the difference between, how did he say it, routine and, was it critical? Problems. Other people have described as the difference early in my work between simple and complex problems. There are lots, some people have described as wicked problems. I use the term adaptive because it brings with it a set of meanings that we can take from biology to understand the process, give us insight into the nature of problem solving when you're facing these kinds of complex challenges. And the first is that problem solving of this sort demands responses outside the current repertoire. You can't simply do what you know how to do already. That the environment itself imposes on you demands that then requires new capacity. And the new capacity is in response to a changed environment. That sustainable success often requires local adaptations to local environments. What's really brilliant about evolution, or if you prefer, what's really brilliant about God's design, is that you don't have to have one size fits all. You have enormous variability, so that in different contexts you have different adaptations. Butterflies with yellow wings and butterflies with fake eyes on them to frighten away certain kinds of predators. And birds and caterpillars, and each is adapted to its environment. Well, many of us in development, we want to come up with a one-size-fits-all, a kind of best practice. As one student of mine described on her year off working in one of our big international development organizations. She flew into Mali. The donors wanted her. They had solutions from other Francophone countries on how to address AIDS. The Minister of Health didn't quite have time. He was somewhat resistant, so she went around him. She only had 4 days to put in place this new project. A very typical mode of operating. No sense of deep respect that departures from a culture need to be adaptive. They need to honor a history. They need to honor a tradition. They need to build from the wisdom of a history and a tradition. They need to start by listening and then figure out what adaptation from this will generate new capacity. And this leads us to this fourth, which ends up being a radical statement, I think, to the development community, but consonant with many of you who are already trying to work in the development community, but against a lot of institutional resistance. "99% of our DNA is the same as a chimpanzee. Highly transformative change in nature is highly conservative. We have extraordinary capacity compared to a chimpanzee. But the food that you just ate is being digested by a chemistry that hasn't changed in 3 billion years. It was developed by bacteria. And it was conserved generation to generation as life became more complex because it was great. And most of our anatomy is identical to our hand. It's the same as the hand of a whale, fin, or bat. I don't know why 5 digits ended up being sort of some special kind of design 100 million years ago, but it stuck. So nature is highly conservative. The reason why that's so important is because the more your intervention, the more your adaptation is rooted in the local culture, the less likely you are to invoke the immune system, the allergic responses, the rejection mechanisms. The more likely it will be to be a source of pride to a people that feels that, look what we've developed here. But we can still honor our core identity, our history, our heritage, the wisdom of our elders. And so many of us in the development world, we act like missionaries. I mean, we have hearts of gold. My former father-in-law worked at the World Bank for his whole career. I deeply admire these institutions. But we frequently parachute into environments as if we've got the keys to the kingdom. And I think those of us who are now pioneering in this area of leadership intervention need to also not oversell our wares. And need to start by listening and placing a person in their role. Understanding who are they? What are they up against? Tell me about the culture. Help me understand the history. What are the expectations? Help me understand the tribal dynamics. Help me understand the networks of families. What will it take if you were to deviate from those historical expectations, even by 3 degrees? Let's think about a way you might do that. How would you prepare and manage people's expectations along the way? Fifth, in nature, frequently the solution already exists in the population. And the job, this was beautifully written about in a little book by colleagues of mine who I brought into the Kennedy School, and then they helped to generate the Developing Differences movement, Matt Andrews' work. A little book called Positive Deviance by Richard Pascal and Jerry and Monique Sternin. Frequently, the solutions exist already in the landscape as a positive variant. And if you listen carefully, frequently the innovation or the seeds of the innovation are already there. And what's wonderful about that, if you can locate it, is that probably that innovation is already more culturally consonant than anything that you import from outside. I just want to say a word about 8, and then I'll stop for questions. I think it's really critically important that we not, in the practice of leadership or development, that we not that we respect the pains of change. If leadership were all about delivering good news, it would be an easy job. But leadership frequently means you're in the business of distributing various kinds of potential or real losses. And when you're consulting and preparing people to practice leadership on tough development problems in their communities, you're asking people, those clients, to practice leadership in engaging their people in accepting the need for various kinds of losses, trade-offs, departures. And those kinds of losses need to be disaggregated and analyzed. Because one strategy of pacing, of framing the issues, of sequencing the issues, of building the proper coalition, of managing information, all of those strategic devices are contingent on an accurate understanding of the nature of the losses that will be distributed around the table amongst the different constituencies that have a stake in that problem. And I'll leave you with just thinking about three kinds of losses that I became acquainted with 35 years ago or longer when I was training in medicine. One night I was working in the emergency room in one of the second largest public hospital in the United States in Brooklyn, New York, called Kings County. The largest is in Chicago, Cook County. A lot of poor people come to Kings County Hospital, and I was an intern there. One night a woman came into the hospital with bruises all over her body. She had been beat up by her boyfriend. I did what I was trained to do. I did my technical problem set. X-rays, she was lucky. Stitches, she was cut in a few places. Ice, a little pain medication, and then my Harvard prescription, my World Bank best practice: leave your boyfriend. She said, "Thank you, Doc," and went back to her boyfriend. She came back a month later with bruises again. I happened to be on call, and I worked with her again, and I did the same things I knew how to do. I pulled out of my tool kit all of my technical solutions. Once again, she thanked me after I said, leave him, and went back to him. 6 weeks later, she came back into the hospital. This time she had bruises on her head. So we kept her in the hospital all night. Because back then, before we had CT scanners in 1978, it was a poor hospital. We couldn't afford one. You kept the person in the hospital all night long, and you observed them, and you woke them up every hour. If they woke up, that was a good sign. It meant they didn't have a slow bleed in their brain. And every hour I went and woke her up. At 3 a.m, after waking her up, I sat by her bed, and this time, instead of telling her what to do, I asked her. I said, "Alice, why are you with him? This is the third time I've seen you." And she said, "Well, he loves me. And most of the time, he loves me really well. I mean, when he's not drinking, he loves me sweet." And I said, "Well, maybe, Alice, you could find a man who will love you just as sweetly, but who doesn't drink and occasionally get violent, because he almost killed you last night." She looked at me and she said, "Oh, really? Well, where am I supposed to find him?" And then she kind of smiled at me and she said, "Are you available?" I was better looking 35 years ago. And I realized at that moment what I thought was an obvious solution was actually for her a huge change. She was going to have to give up the love she had with no guarantees of anything better. And who is going to hold her? Who is going to hold her through a sustained period of disequilibrium? Who is going to hold her while she developed new capacity? And as I kept talking to her, I realized not only was she going to experience the direct loss of the love she had, she was also going to experience two other forms of loss that were really profound. The first was competence. She told me, I know how to go into a bar and meet a guy. People from my own world. Now you're asking me to learn how to talk to and become friendly with a man who drinks coffee. What are we supposed to talk about? Philosophy? Politics? I don't know how to do that. And I realized we are all proud of our competence. We all work incredibly hard to be seen as the go-to person, because we feel important in the world when we have a competence that other people can rely on. But it's hard to bring people to the frontier of their competence, because the development of new capacity requires crossing that frontier and feeling incompetent. And then helping people, holding people in that incompetent zone until they finally learn and develop a new competency. And holding people through that learning process is a very challenging thing for them, because it's an assault on their pride and dignity. It can be. And finally, Alice taught me about a third, perhaps the most profound source of loss and therefore resistance to change. She said, my mother has stayed with my father for more than 30 years. And once in a while he would get drunk and he would hit her, but she never got too badly hurt. Isn't that the right thing to do, to stay true to your man? And I realized, what's going to happen if she breaks up with her boyfriend, Jack, and then she goes home and visits on a Sunday? What will her mother say? How does she explain to her mother that she provided a model of tolerating abuse that no woman should tolerate? How does she say to her father, you know, Father, I can honor 99% of your DNA, your love, your wisdom, your tradition. You never abused me, but you shouldn't have behaved that way towards Mother. And I've kicked Jack out. It took me a long time to learn to stand up to him, because Mother never stood up to you. How can she say that? That's the renegotiating of a loyalty. The renegotiating of a loyalty that anchors your identity, because you're identified with that community, those people, that family, where you're departing from that historical repertoire. You're departing from that history. But that means that you risk being accused of betrayal. The mother could say, I'm proud of you, daughter. But she could also say, shame on you. Don't you know all I've done for you? How can you speak that way about your father? He's loved you so well. A strain in that relationship may require months or even years to repair. When we're asking people to provide leadership, we're asking people to engage in the risk of having to renegotiate loyalties, of pushing people to their frontier of competence and across that frontier, and of accepting the need for losses on behalf of being able to preserve and conserve what's most precious and valuable from a tradition and history. That's how I begin to understand the guts of adaptive work, and therefore the heart of the work of leadership. Anyway, thank you for letting me begin to frame some of the challenges